Здравствуйте. I'm very glad to be here with you this morning. As the director said, I have visited here a number of times, but it's here I am no longer in the government service. And the reason that I'm not is that the Republican Party won the election 4 years ago, and the Democratic Party, which is my party, lost, and so I lost my job. But I am, as has been explained, very, very busy. One of the things that took a lot of my time was to write my memoirs, and I have some very nice recollections of my time with President Putin, and also with Boris Yeltsin before that, and then very good times with Foreign Minister Primakov and Foreign Minister Ivanov, and then now Foreign Minister Lavrov was the ambassador at the United Nations when I was there. And I think we had excellent relations at the time that we were in office. We had a lot of very interesting discussions, too, about cooperation. And we talked about economic reform and the Balkans and Iraq and NATO enlargement. We did disagree sometimes, but we also figured out ways to work together. And what we had were U.S. and Russian peacekeepers that served side by side in Bosnia and Kosovo. During President Clinton's time in office, the G7 became the G8, and our two governments also cooperated very closely on measures to ensure the safety of nuclear materials that were left over from the former Soviet Union. I think that is one of the agreements that is clearly incredibly important given now the danger of the spread of nuclear materials. We had a very large agenda with Russia, and most of it was work, but sometimes we had a lot of fun also. And I have great memories of in St. Petersburg when Foreign Minister at that time, still Foreign Minister Primakov, gave me a tour of L'Ermitage during the White Nights, which was, I think, one of the truly memorable activities. And then attending La Traviata with Foreign Minister Ivanov. But the funniest part, I have to tell you, you will never believe this, but foreign ministers at the ASEAN meetings, actually the last night, have to perform a skit. Every country is a play, and every country does its own play starring the foreign minister. And so one year, as a surprise, Foreign Minister Primakov and I did a show together. And instead of the West Side Story, it was called the East-West Story. And I came out singing, "The most beautiful sound I ever heard, Yevgeny." And he came out and sang, Maдлен Олбрайт, Maдлен Олбрайt. I just met a girl called Maдлен Олбрайт. I have enjoyed very much teaching at Georgetown, but I also have been involved in our presidential campaign. And our election is supposed to be very close, and the voters go to the polls on November 2nd. And obviously, we are all very interested in what is going to happen. I'm also head of an organization called the National Democratic Institute that works around the world to promote and strengthen democracy. And I believe that this is important because history shows that democratic governments are better able to provide for the needs of their people and more likely to live in peace with each other and less likely to solve their problems with violence. We've learned a lot about how hard it really is to build democracy. It is not something that happens overnight, and the reason is that democracy not only promises us the right to express our own views, but it also promises the right to others to disagree with our views. It gives us the right to due process under the law, but it also promises the right to criminals or people we believe to be criminals. Democracy also promises us the right to practice our religion, of our choice, but it leaves open the possibility for others to practice their religions. And it allows us to vote for candidates of our choice, but it also leaves the possibility that those candidates will lose. So that is the complication of democracy. It's not a perfect system. And as the history of every country that ever tried it reflects, democracy can be very noisy and confusing and chaotic. When democratic institutions are weak, they're vulnerable to manipulation by the rich and the powerful, and they may be attacked and undermined by organized crime. They may also be the target of terrorists, as I know that all of the citizens of Russia know, as well as those of the United States. And let me say how shocked we all were with the horrors and killings in Beslan, and that it shocked the whole world. I went to the Russian embassy in the United States to express my sympathies, and I made a contribution to the families and victims. So there's no question that terrorism is a despicable act, and killing children is in its own category of evil. And those responsible everywhere have to be tracked down and destroyed, and the governments have the responsibility to protect our citizens. And it really is very important that citizens in all countries work together to protect ourselves. But it is also very important to defend democracy and the freedoms on which democracy is based, because we can't allow the terrorists to take away our freedoms. Sometimes because of security problems or economic setbacks or social clashes, we are tempted to think that democracy is a luxury that we can't afford. And this temptation arises in every country. We've seen it at various times in Latin America and in Asia and in Europe, and now also in the United States. But the truth is that freedom and order are not opposites. And in the long run, you can't have one without the other. Security and stability are best built upon a foundation of law within which the rights and responsibilities of every citizen are spelled out. And in such a system, people who have legitimate grievances can turn to the courts or to their mayor or to the governor or to the Duma or any place to get a fair hearing. And I think it's always very important to see that there is a clear separation between those who seek change through peaceful means and those who turn instead to the tools of coercion and violence. And society as a whole has to ensure that peaceful change is possible and violent change is rejected. So I think this is a time when we know how hard it is to build democracy and how we have to cooperate, and I think this is a period also in which there can be great cooperation between the United States and Russia. I'm very happy now to have a chance to take your questions in whatever subject you like, and one of the best parts about no longer being Secretary of State, I can answer your questions, and we can just deal as if I were an ordinary professor visiting a class of a lot of smart students. So anything you want to talk about, I'm glad to do.
Thank you very much. Сейчас у нас есть время, пожалуйста. Вопросы. Пожалуйста.
So, Ms. Olbryt, you are known to be an expert in Russia study, and would you please comment on the institutional reform recently announced by our president, and tell us your views on promoting democracy by this way?
You know, I used to say that I was an expert in the Soviet Union, which basically made me an archaeologist. And as I look around my own library at home, I see how out of date my books are. I used to teach a course on U.S.-Soviet relations and divided my class so that one half were Soviet students and one half were American students, and then I made them switch. But all that is out of date, and I'm very glad to be here in a different Russia. Let me say this. I think that clearly it is not easy to run Russia these days, and it is very hard, I think, for a country to have been one of the two superpowers and then have a different role. And the whole question about what Russian identity is at this point, a great nation that in fact really changed a great deal as a result of the end of the communist system. But I have to tell you frankly, those of us on the outside are quite troubled by some of the changes that President Putin has put in terms of what has happened with the different choosing of the governors and some intimation that the judicial system is also going to be changed. Clearly, the elections have produced a Duma that is more friendly to President Putin. And I think that there is a real question about the directions in which Russia should go. And one of the reasons that I made the comments that I did is that in order for a democracy to function well, there need to be strong parties and there needs to be opposition. When we started the National Democratic Institute, one of the questions we asked ourselves is, what is democracy about? What creates a democracy? And a lot of people said elections. And the truth is that it's not elections, because as you remember here, you had elections and 99.9% of the voters were said to have voted for the communists. So it's not elections. It is actually the existence of an opposition party and the possibility of changing. I know opposition party, I'm out. I am in the opposition party. We are trying to take over the government again. And we are doing it through a process of elections that are carried out throughout our country. Our governors are very strong. They are divided between Democrats and Republicans, and they are not controlled out of Washington. So I think we were troubled by what President Putin has done. And we are watching very carefully, because one thing, again out of my remarks, is it is very important for the US and Russia to have good relations and be partners, because there are so many things we have to do together in other parts of the world.
Madam Albright, we all know that you were the first woman assigned Secretary of State in the United States. So my question is, was it difficult for you, being a woman, to play your role in the world of politics, and what advantages and disadvantages does it bring?
Well, there were a lot of questions, actually, as to whether a woman could be Secretary of State of the United States. And what I found was that I did not have trouble when I traveled abroad. I came in a very big plane that said United States of America. And I had there was a lot of respect, just because I represented the United States. When I'm asked this question at home in the US, I say I actually had more problems with the men in my own government. And the reason for that is not that they were all male chauvinist pigs, but because but really because they had known me so long. I had lived in Washington for, most of my adult life, and I was a mother, and I had driven my children to school, and I was friends with their wife, and I was on a school board, and I was a staff member for a senator, and I made a lot of coffee, and I Xeroxed, and I did all those things. And I then slowly worked my way up through the political system, but then they thought, how did Maдлен get to be Secretary of State? So they had more problems with him. The fun part is to think is, what difference did it make for me to be a woman Secretary of State? I used to say makeup. That was the only difference between me and a man Secretary of State. And that I wore a skirt. As far as we know, no former Secretary of State ever wore a skirt, we think. But the real difference is that I know more about the art of diplomatic kissing than any of my predecessors. When I went to Latin America, sometimes they kiss on the right cheek and sometimes on the left cheek, but I would always get very mixed up. The French would kiss twice. The Dutch and the Belgians kiss 3 times. And in Botswana, Russians too, Botswana 4 times. And then there's Arafat. Just the thought, right, of kissing Arafat. So those are the differences.
Madeline Albright, you were talking in a short speech about the transformation of the G7 into the G8, so I have a question in connection with this. How can you comment on John Kerry's recent statement about Russia, that Russia should be excluded from the G8, and what are the reasons for this stance? How do you?
I think the explanation is the following, and it has something to do with the first question that was asked. Generally a concern about the direction in which Russia is going on its democracy, and then also what is happening in Chechnya. I have to say that when I was secretary, there were always many questions about how the issue of Chechnya was being handled, and we had said many, many times that it had to be handled through a political solution, that there were no military solutions to Chechnya. And of course, things have gotten worse, not better. And it is that sense that Chechnya is not being handled in a way that leads to a resolution. And I think there is a genuine question about where democratization is headed in Russia, and the G7 is composed of industrialized democracies. There were questions originally about when President Clinton thought that Russia should join the G8. There were questions, as you know, the G7 plus meetings, the finance ministers met as the G7 because people felt that the system was not yet a fully market system. And the G8 part was the political part, but President Clinton felt very strongly that it was important to encourage President Yeltsin and then President Putin in terms of being a part of the democratic political establishment of the world through the G8. And I think that this was just an idea that, a little warning about the fact that things were not going in the right direction. I do know that Senator Kerry understands and wants to have the very best relations with Russia. I don't think anybody ever, as I said earlier, wants to go back to a relationship where we are adversaries, and that will never happen again. But there is a difference between being flat-out adversaries and actually being able to do things together, which is why I said how important it was when we were able to cooperate. We clearly need to cooperate on fighting terrorism, and we need to cooperate on issues that are the new transnational issues of climate change and disease and poverty, and I think it's important for Americans to respect Russia as a great power and for the Russians to respect America, but a democratic path is the best way.
Hello, I'm Catherine Preobrazhensky. I'm the first-year student. My question is the following. In March this year, in your interview to the Vedomosti newspaper, you've criticized George Bush for not, for closing his eyes on the politics of Vladimir Putin as a reward to Putin's approval of the war in Iraq. And you've also expressed concern about the Chechen question. Well, you've said that you regret that this question, this problem, hadn't been politically accordingly dealt with in the beginning. And you said, again, once again, you've accused George Bush of like not doing anything about it. As a consequence, can we say that you are for the interference of the USA in political matters of sovereign states, of independent states?
Well, the question in the end is different than your comment. But anyway, let me say that I think that in the world today, because we know so much about what is going on in each other's countries, and there is concern when human rights are undermined someplace. When I was at the United Nations, one of the interesting things is sitting in the Security Council every day where you talk about what is going on inside other countries. And I think to myself sometimes, this, people are dying somewhere and we're sitting here writing resolutions and worrying about where the commas go. This is really ridiculous. Why are we doing this? And then other days I would sit there and I would think, this is truly remarkable that 15 countries can sit and worry about what is going on inside somebody else's country. It's quite a different shift from where we used to be, and that there is the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the Charter of the United Nations that really talks about the necessity of knowing what is going on in some other country. And I don't think that that is interference. I think that it is a responsibility to talk about human rights problems in other countries. And that is what we were doing, I continue to do, in discussing what the issue is in Chechnya. What is happening now, because people are quite critical of what is happening in the United States with the prisoners in Guantanamo, or what happened in Abu Ghraib, now the world is talking about some of our internal activities. And that is where the world is at this point. We have responsibilities for each other, and I don't think that that is an interference. It is the kind of thing that happens in the 21st century when we have a lot of information about what is going on. And I think that as the world community, that is appropriate.
Mrs. Albright, in general, what is your point of view about the situation in the U.S.-Russia relations now? Have we the relations of cooperation? Have we the relations of opposition and contradictions? Or the main idea in Washington, D.C. that Russia has no importance in contemporary world? This is my question. Thank you.
Well, you know what is interesting? I grew up in the era when our relations with the Soviet Union were central to everything. As we all know, it was a very dangerous and troublesome era. One cannot say any longer that Russia is central to American foreign policy, but I also, on the other hand, do not think it's not unimportant. I think it is important. Maybe it's because I've spent my whole life looking at Russia, so I will never think it is unimportant. But for the most part, I think people see the importance of Russia, but not as the central concern as it was before, which is good, I think, in that regard. I personally think that as far as I know, I mean, the truth is I know nothing anymore because all I do is read the newspapers and not see intelligence reporting. But it is my understanding that there is good cooperation on intelligence between Russia and the United States, and that we are trying to figure out how to deal with the terrorist threat. I also understand that what was something that we started, which was the Russia NATO Council cooperation, has now been expanded, and that is working pretty well. And the quartet, as far as the Middle East is concerned, is a vehicle for cooperation. I'm not sure it's being used because I myself have been very critical of the lack of interest in the Middle East. You know, that the roadmap has not really been put on the table, or as we say, I say, it hasn't been taken out of the glove compartment of the car. So we are not really following a roadmap. I think that the personal relations between President Putin and President Bush are very good. But you know what is so interesting? Every party, when we were in office, and the Republicans were in their campaign, they said, isn't it ridiculous? The whole relationship between Russia and the US is based on Boris and Bill, and then with Vladimir and Bill, and that it should be much more institutionalized. And that's what candidate Bush used to say. Now, candidate Kerry is saying the same thing about President Bush, saying, you know, why is it that the whole thing is just based on the relationship of two people? And I think that is a problem. I think there needs to be greater relationship among the different institutions and our parliamentarians and all that. So I believe that the relationships could be much better, that we really could do more things in partnership, that we could deal with some regional issues, but the most important issue, in addition to fighting terrorism, is getting control over nuclear materials. And here, Russia has a very important responsibility and a role, since there is concern that some of the nuclear sites here are not properly guarded, and that there still is a great deal of fissile material and various other things out there. And for that reason, I think there should be greater cooperation. But I personally would love to see much more common work between Russia and the United States.
Mrs. Albright, how...
Just
Another 10 minutes or so. 10 minutes, yeah. No.
How would you explain...
Yes, okay, yes. Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Okay.
How would you explain that today more and more women occupy high government posts, and what is the role of women in the politics today?
Well, I think that there are more and more women because they are finally realizing how smart we are. But there's still not enough women. I think that there needs to be a continued support system among women. I now head a group in the world of all women ministers throughout the world. There are about 600 women ministers in all the countries, and it's a very big network. But there are still not enough women, especially in foreign policy and international relations. So I'm very glad to see all the women here, because it has to come up from having educated women. And then women have to help each other. I feel very strongly about this, and in the United States, I often say that there is a very special place in hell for women who don't help other women.
So we have just said that the relations between our countries mostly depend on the relations between our presidents. So what do you think, which of the candidates for presidency in case of victory will set up better relations with Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin, and why?
I think that the truth is that whoever gets elected will try to have good relations with President Putin. Because it's important for us to have good relations. But it can't be just between President Putin and, I hope, everybody knows I'm for President Kerry, so it's not a secret. And I would imagine that the relations would be good. But the relations, I think also that there will be some statements about what is going on in terms of democracy in Russia. People are concerned about what is happening, because it seemed to be a direction earlier where there was more kind of the sense that democracy was evolving in Russia. And people, so it goes back to an earlier question. I think people are concerned about the steps that President Putin has taken recently. They are concerned about what is happening with the media and generally in terms of some of the practices. And I actually think that friends need to tell each other when there are problems. Partnerships and friendships are based on honesty. And I would imagine that President Putin would tell an American president, I'm worried about what is going on in Guantanamo, or worried about what is happening in Iraq, because that is the kind of a relationship that friends have with each other.
Just a moment.
Vitaly Alenikov said, you're a student. Mrs. Olbryt, I'd like to ask you a question about the situation in such a country as the Republic of Belarus. What is your attitude to the recent elections and referendum held there? And what actions do you expect to be taken by the European Union and your country in this regard? Thank you.
Well, I think the elections in Belarus are not. I think they were, according to the international community, they were elections that were fraudulent. And Mr. Lukashenko is the last dictator in Europe. And I think it is a tragedy what has happened to the people of Belarus. And it is unclear about what people will do, but I do not think that anybody should believe that there were free and fair elections in Belarus. The question now is what is going to happen in Ukraine, which is a country that is very important where there need to be free and fair elections. And I would hope that it would be evident to everybody that we are stronger, all of us together, when countries are able to have free and fair elections. And what has happened in Belarus is very troubling. I was reading in the paper today about a variety of that there are fighting, people are fighting and being beaten up and things like that. This is not a good atmosphere for democracy.
Varvara Greznova, the third-year international law student. Madam Albright, what do you think of the film Fahrenheit 9/11?
Well, for a long time I didn't go and see it because the lines were so long, and I thought, what are people going to say? What is she doing standing in line waiting to see this movie? I think that some of it is very interesting. Some of it, I think, is probably overly exaggerated. But a lot of people in our country are concerned about the war in Iraq. Why did the war in Iraq happen? And I personally, well, let me back up on something. 9/11 was an incredible event for the United States. And I wasn't born in the United States. I was born in Czechoslovakia, and I am a naturalized citizen, but I spent the war in England. So I grew up as a child seeing buildings bombed and devastated. Most Americans never had that happen to them. So when 9/11 happened, it was an incredible shock to the American system. And I think everybody agreed that it was a good idea to go after Osama bin Laden and the Taliban in Afghanistan. That was something that people agreed with. But the war in Iraq seemed to many people as a diversion from what we were supposed to be doing, which was finding Osama bin Laden, and that the link between Iraq and 9/11 and Osama bin Laden was never really proven. And so Fahrenheit 9/11 built on that concept that the war was something that was unnecessary. But just frankly, I mean, it's an interesting movie, but I thought that some of it was a little over the top, as we would say. But it was very, especially the part about the mother was very moving. Have you all seen Fahrenheit 9/11? Is it a popular movie here? What? Was. Quite. Well, it's very popular in the U.S., but it has also been denounced. And, but I have to tell you, it's a real sign of American freedom that this movie is out there now. And it's important to understand. It has a little bit to do with what I said, is every time you, in a democracy, when you have one view, you will always have the other view, and that is the strength of democracy.
Ms. Albright, what do you think, what are the main differences between Bush's and Kerry's Iraqi policy?
Well, let me say one thing, which is that one of the things that's very hard for a former high-level official is to criticize the President of the United States in another country. But we are in a classroom, and we have to be honest. I think the main differences are that Senator Kerry, from the very beginning, had talked about the necessity of internationalizing any conflict. And when he voted for the resolution in Congress, it was basically to support the president in trying to work out a diplomatic solution, trying to give him the strength to go into the United Nations. And what was interesting was that President Bush actually won a great victory when he got the inspectors back in. And so Senator Kerry felt that it was important to let the inspectors do their job longer until it was evident that either there were or weren't weapons, and that it would have allowed for a true coalition. So that's the first difference. The other part, I think, now has to do with the prosecution of a war that is, we have said, is a war of choice, not of necessity, but finding an end to it is a necessity and not a choice. And so the differences are, again, in really trying to internationalize the fighting, which we believe that Senator Kerry has a better chance of doing than President Bush, training the Iraqis more rapidly in greater numbers, multilateralizing the contracts, that the contracts for reconstruction of Iraq cannot just be American contracts, but have to go to other countries, and then giving greater support to the democratization of Iraq, not imposing democracy, but offering democracy. What is interesting in many ways is that some of the things that President Bush is doing now are actually things that Senator Kerry suggested a year and a half ago. And slowly reality is kind of sinking in on the Bush administration about things that have to be done. There have been a very interesting series of articles in the Washington Post, New York Times, and now in the Herald Tribune about mistakes that were made in terms of taking apart the Iraqi army completely, and not building on letting the Iraqis run the country themselves. But those are the main differences. But I think the main difference generally between them is that Senator Kerry really does believe in international cooperation, in alliance structures, in diplomacy, and not so much of a unilateral and unidimensional approach to foreign policy. There are so many issues out there that have been completely forgotten during the last 3.5 years, that just this administration has been so focused on Iraq that we have forgotten about Africa and Latin America and having broader relationships throughout the world. Well, thank you all very, very much. Come visit me in New York.
Дорогие друзья, я думаю, что все мы получили удовольствие и очень интересная встреча. И я думаю, что если бы у вас было время, она могла бы длиться много-много дольше, поскольку вопросов много у наших студентов и у профессоров. Но я хотел бы сердечно вас еще раз поблагодарить. Хотел бы на память о нашей встрече подарить вот такую книгу, только что вышедшую к 60-летию нашего университета. И здесь есть, кстати, фотография встречи Клинтона с нашими студентами. И вот такую нашу медаль на память о об институте. И вы знаете, дорогие друзья, у меня была возможность с профессором Олбрайт поговорить немножко до нашей встречи, и профессор Олбрайт упомянула о том, что у нее было бы желание приехать в Россию не на 2-3 дня, как сейчас, а подольше. И я предложил приехать в качестве visiting professor в наш университет и побыть с нами. Если это реализуется, я думаю, что мы будем очень довольны этим.
Это будет очень хорошо.